So my name, uh, before the war, everybody called me Akira, but it got shortened to a nickname Aki, A-K-I. Horii is the last name, Horii. The whole family, all my children say Horii. Everybody say Horii, but if you write it in Japanese characters, there are two I's at the end. Horii. So two kanji. Horii is character for castle moat, and E is wow. So Horii, but everybody says Horii. Horii. And so I was born in Vancouver on October 6, 1931. So I will be 91 in about 4 months' time. Still alive. And family back, I was born in the Vancouver General Hospital. So I didn't find out till way into my adult life about my parents, where they met and where they got married and those kinds of things. But if you want the details, I can give it to you. Horii, grandfather Horii and his wife immigrated to Vancouver in 1907, and he must have been about 32 years of age. And through this ancestry, I got some information that they were living on Main Street near Powell. And the couple had no children. So what they did was adopted my father, whose surname was Hayashi. And so he came to Vancouver at age 16 in 1923. He's born in 1908 and was adopted with a Horii couple, had changed his name from Hayashi to Horii. And that I didn't know till, as I say, into my adulthood. So he, as a teenager, helped my grandfather fish for lingcod up near Paul River, that area. And he came from a small village called Mirozu, Mirozu, Wakayama province. And that's where my mother also came from. So everything was arranged, I think. So my mother left Mirozu at age 19 and came to Vancouver, and they got married in Vancouver. So my father is now a Horii, and so my parents got married, and I was born in she came in 1930, and they got married, and I was born in October 1931. So when my mother was about 8 months pregnant, my grandmother Horii, adoptive grandmother, and my mother were crossing Paul Street when a pickup truck suddenly appeared and just missed my mother and hit my grandmother. And she got tossed and got hooked on the door handle and was dragged down Powell Street for about 2 blocks and people kept yelling, and the driver finally stopped. But she was taken to the Vancouver General Hospital, where she died from her injuries. And so I never knew my grandmother, adopted grandmother. So if that truck had hit my mother, obviously I won't be here. And so luckily my mother survived. And it turns out that my real grandmother, my maternal grandmother, was a sister to grandmother Horii. So the grandmother that got killed was really my aunt, my maternal aunt. And actually, my real maternal grandmother, I got to meet her. She was in her 80s, and I was called to Japan in 1961. My parents were on a tour, and my mother got quite ill with nosebleed, and was in a private hospital, and my grandfather sent a telegram saying that come quickly, my mother might die any day. So in those days, to get a passport, it took about a week, applying to Ottawa and so on. So I flew to Seattle and went to the Canadian consulate in Seattle and got a passport, flew back to Vancouver right away, boarded a Canadian Airlines airplane and flew to Japan. And that's how I met my maternal grandmother. That was 61.
Oh, 61.
Yeah. So that was sort of give you a background of name change. So Mary Kawamoto was a Nakashima, I think, maiden name. And I think she lived, so when I was born and I was a little boy, I was living about a block away from the Japanese language school, and lived there for a few years. And the Tsuchiya family, and George Tsuchiya was a good friend in those days. And but eventually we moved to Heatley Avenue, 368 Heatley Avenue, just north of Mikado, on that block. And so when I started school, so I started going to Lower Strathcona Elementary School. It was about a block and a half away. And then would come home, change books, and would walk probably 3 blocks to the Japanese language school after elementary school. And from 4 o'clock to 5:30 p.m. for an hour and a half, I guess, we studied Japanese language. I remember a few things preschool. For instance, from Heatley Avenue, I attended kindergarten at the United Church, right on the corner where the Buddhist church is now, on Jackson and Powell Street, southeast corner. And Reverend Shimizu was the reverend then, and there was a can't remember his first name. I think his first name was Ted Shimizu, was a classmate of mine. So I attended kindergarten. Actually went to Sunday school at that same United Church for about, I don't know, months or a year maybe, and under Reverend Shimizu. I have to say that English was a second language because the spoken language at home was Japanese, and going to Japanese language school, I studied the Japanese language more than the English language. I mean, I did homework for doing the Japanese language, didn't do any homework from Strathcona Elementary. So it's interesting when I look back that even playing with my classmates, my friends, we spoke Japanese more than English. And I can recall, for instance, one of my best friends was Tanaka, and they had a rice mill on Paul Street off Heatley Avenue. And I'd go walking down there, and instead of talking to him in English, I would say, "Teru o asobimashou ka?" Shall we play today in English, in Japanese? And all the Japanese kids on Heatley Avenue probably spoke Japanese rather than English. That's why we spoke Japanese more. We only spoke English at elementary school. Yeah.
So you enjoyed going to Japanese language school?
I enjoyed it. Yes. We went to the old building in the Japanese language school, which is gone now. And the main building was for the seniors, and the back portion was the auditorium. And at the end of the school term, we had a sort of a graduation of not graduating from the Japanese language school, but finishing the school term. And we were given awards for scholastic achievements. And I remember there were 3 of us. We were competing for awards. And there was a guy by the name of Kazuo Arima. And there are a few things I remember. He had a good voice, and he sang in the church choir in the St. James Church, which is still there on Gore Avenue, I think, in Cordova. He was a very smart kid. And I competed with Tamiko Nakamura and myself. And so we would alternately get first, second, or third awards. And I remember we would march down the aisle to get the award from the principal, Sato. Yeah. So, but Tamiko was my classmate in Japanese school and Strathcona school. So we were, good friends. But when the war started, we all parted, and the only person I communicated with was Tero Tanaka, and his family was interned in North Kamloops. I guess few families got to go there, and but a lot of Niseis my age, we all had Japanese names, which we used before the war, and I never had a middle name, but a lot of people, like my brothers and the younger ones, all got middle names. So Teruo Tanaka became Bob Tanaka, and he passed away a few years ago. But we became good friends. We post-war, and he went to University of Toronto, became a chemical engineer, got a job in the nuclear plant in Port Hope, and I visited him a few times, and he visited us several times. So, yeah, we were friends in being separated, quite a distance across the country. But the others, the friends that we grew up with pre-war, I lost contact. I don't know where they went. Yes, one friend, we communicated by mail, and he was interned in Lemon Creek. His father refused to go to work in a road camp, so he ended up in Angler POW camp in Ontario. And when the war ended, he was forced to go. He was deported with the parents back to Japan, although he was born in Vancouver. And he told me that he was treated badly by the Japanese people in Japan. He didn't get an education there, and then he decided to come back by himself, back to Vancouver around 1952. And he couldn't get a job because he had no trades, no education, so he joined the Canadian Army and became a lifetime soldier. I saw him in Ottawa, and he came to Vancouver. He married a Japanese girl from Japan, actually, and after he retired from the army, and being an enlisted man, the highest rank is sergeant. So he became a sergeant, and he's buried in a military cemetery in Ottawa, because he got a part-time job in the military, I think, after the war. But he's one of the few friends that I remember. Yeah. So I was 10 years of age, having born in 31. So 10 years of age, and all I remember is okay, I've got few things I could tell you before that.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
Sure.
about what it was like
Okay.
growing up in Vancouver.
Okay.
So one was going to movies, and there's a movie theater called the Star Theater, right on Main Street, where the police station is, just north of Hastings. And my mother would give me 10 cents, and for 5 cents, I would walk down to a corner store on Healy Avenue, and for a penny you could buy red ginger or like a sweet and sour prunes. We used to call it suisaimo. I don't know whether that was Chinese or not. And but 5 cents you could buy a bag of Spanish peanuts, small bag of Spanish peanuts, or they call it broken cookies that are broken, and for 5 cents. And then we go to the theater for 5 cents, Star Theater. And if down Hastings Street, west of Maine, there was a Royal Theater near the Roosevelt Hotel. And there was a Rex Theater, Lux Theater. Beacon Theater was a little bit more expensive. I think cost 10 cents rather than 5 cents. And they had a stage where heroes, boyhood heroes, Western movies, Hopalong Cassidy, Roy Rogers, Gene Autry, they would appear on stage with the horse, and occasionally my mother would give us 25 cents to go to a theater on Granville Street. And Granville, in those days, pre-war, was Theater Row, I guess you would call it. And I could name them off. There was Strand Theater across from the bay on Georgia. There was Plaza, Paradise, Studio Theater. There was the Capitol Theater, the Orpheum Theater, and the Vogue Theater. The Vogue, I think, was the newest. And they're all gone now. I don't know whether the Vogue Theater is still there, but the Orpheum, I'm happy they kept the Orpheum because I was a member of I was a season ticket holder of the Orpheum, the Vancouver Symphony, for over 50 years. And I finally quit as a member this year because, being Saturday evening, and I couldn't leave my wife alone at home because she became disabled with her back problem. So that's one thing I did, going to theaters for 5 cents, 10 cents. And the other thing we did a lot, my father was a lingcod fisherman. And most of the lingcod fishermen came from that little village, fishing village called Mirozu. And do you know Rosalie Nakashima? Suzanne knows Rosalie because Rosalie's husband, McAllister, Carrie, and I knew Carrie, and he was a good friend of Suzanne's father, Sus Tabata. But so my father was away a lot to Lund area to fish for lingcod. Lund is a little Finnish village just 20 odd miles north of Powell River, and it's actually the end of the road of the Sunshine Road Highway, Sunshine Highway. And while he was away, my mother had my grandfather retired when my grandmother got killed, car accident. And so the adults at home in Healy Avenue were my mother and my grandfather, Horii. and they had no idea what the kids were doing. You know, on weekends, for instance, we did a lot of roller skating. So we roller skated to Stanley Park, and that's quite a distance from Healy Avenue, and to look for tadpole and frog eggs. And we take a glass jar, and Stanley Park was a forest, and we'd go looking for ditches with water running, and we find frog eggs, and we'd bring them home and watch them hatch into tadpoles and eventually in adult eggs or frogs. So that was one adventure. We would walk across the Burrard Bridge through downtown Vancouver, Burrard Bridge, to Kitsilano to go swimming. And they had rafts offshore, off the beach. I know my mother gave me 5 cents or 10 cents, and friends and I would go swimming. And one highlight was, and I really look forward to, was to buy French fries for 5 cents or 10 cents and eat French fries on the beach and then go swimming. And we could have drowned. My mother would have no idea. And so that's another thing. And another pastime going to Strathcona was playing chestnut, playing with chestnuts. Do you know anything about that? Well, chestnut trees, you had to go to the Peony area, and so we'd roller skate to these areas and find chestnuts on the ground. And you drew a hole through the chestnut, and you hang about half a dozen chestnuts on a strong string, and you have one chestnut on the bottom, and your opponent with his chestnut would go like this, and you try to break your chestnut. And then, so that was a pastime, looking for chestnuts. And people got smart. They dried the chestnuts so it would get hard. So it would be harder to break. So that's, and Falls Creek, from north of Hastings, Falls Creek, south of Pryor Street, was swamp. And we would go there during the winter when it was frozen. And we tried to skate with roller skates, I guess. We didn't have ice skates. So those were pastimes. We didn't spend much money in terms of buying toys. One thing was marbles. So marbles, we played even with the girls in the neighborhood. Marbles, different games of marbles. And things that we bought was yo-yo, and there were cheap yo-yos and there were more expensive yo-yos. And the other thing was a thing called bolo. Have you heard of bolo? It was like a small racket with a rubber ball attached to a rubber string, and you hit it. And there was a cheap racket and a more expensive racket, and those are the only things that cost money. But there was a thing that we did, and we called it mango sango. And mango sango sounds like it was Chinese, but somebody invented the word mango sango. But you know the orange cover, the paper, and you cut it into like fronds, and you went to a local garage and got a washer, and you put it in the middle of the paper, and this thing you kick with your foot like this, and you count how many times you could kick it before it would fall onto the ground. So that was a game that didn't cost any money, and things like kick the can and hide and seek and you know, even we played with the girls with skipping rope, with a big rope where two people hold the rope, and I could remember the song you sang in Japanese.
Oh.
You know, Ojo sama Okaeri, arigato, janken poi, maketa okata wa ode nasai. It means, you know, come in, thank you. You play janken poi, and then the loser now get out, and then another. And this is what we did. But things like that. At Laura sang the song "You Yake Koyake," things like that. I could remember the words. We learned probably as a child playing or Japanese language school. But Ryan Allen, he found these Japanese language school tables, so that brought fond memories. So I guess we sat two students to a table, and I remember, and it's unfortunate I've forgotten the names of the teachers. I could remember the names of the teachers at Strathcona, but not at the Japanese language school. But I think Laura probably has that picture of a concert I was in, and Mrs. Sato was the teacher who taught us what to do during the concert, and it was called Sarukani Kassen, and Saru is a monkey, and Kani is a crab. So Kazuo Arima, that smart kid, was the monkey, and I was the crab, Kani, and the monkey went up the tree, and he was throwing kaki, you know, and he was throwing kaki onto me, and then I'd be falling onto the floor, and I'd say, ouch, ouch, ouch. But there's a picture of that group in the Japanese language school.
And you had a crab.
And we had a crab thing on the head. And Teruo, my friend Bob Tanaka, was a bee, and there was a overweight child, and he was that, what do you call that thing that You make mochi,
Oh,
that wooden stand? And
not uzu. The other one. Uzu. No.
something like that.
Anyway.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I did enjoy the Japanese language school. So when I was intern in East Lillooet, I did take private lessons from a lady for another year. So I knew quite a bit of kanji, and I could still write simple kanji and all the hirakana and katakana, and I communicate with my cousins in Japan, and sometimes I would write a short note in my poor language, but I could still communicate verbally. And I told Laura that, when I practiced medicine, half my early Japanese patients were Issei's, and they couldn't speak English, so I had to communicate with them in Japanese. So, and all the medical terms I learned, the organs and the diseases and so on. So I managed to do that. So I got to grade 5.
Grade 5.
Actually, we never, because the war started, beginning of December. So we were halfway through the grades. Grade 5, both schools, grade 5. But when we started school in September 42 in East Lillooet, I started in grade 6. There was no Japanese language school. You could get private lessons, and but there was no certificate or anything.
Nothing like that.
Nothing. I don't recall getting a certificate from the Japanese language school at the end of each year.
Oh, really?
I don't have it anyways.
Oh.
Well, I had to communicate with my parents in Japanese till both parents had died. So, and my father died in 1996. So I was speaking the Japanese language till then. And then my Japanese language sort of deteriorated since then because there was no further use of the language except to talk to my cousins in Japan over the phone, or whenever I visited Japan, I spoke to them in Japanese. Yes. So, but I can still speak quite a bit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
of course. And you're interested
Yeah.
in it.
And I got to know the Satos. They came to East Lillooet once, and there's a group picture in there. I'm in there somewhere. But after the war, they came to Vancouver, and they had a house. I remember the house on Victoria Drive, around 37, 38, somewhere around there. And I remember I was asked by the Japanese community to give a talk in Japanese about breast cancer. And so I remember going to the Sato's residence, and I asked Mr. Sato, can you teach me what to say in Japanese about, because I really didn't study much about This is in the early 60s, few short years into my practice. So, but they were very gracious, and they told me what to do. So just for a year after, during the internment, 1942, for about a year, I guess, and that's it. I'd had to use the Japanese English dictionary to find the words, how to say stomach or bow in Japanese. Yeah. So it was useful. I practiced for 42 years of my own practice, and then I retired, but I got bored, so they asked me to work part-time, and I worked part-time, and I went to a clinic in downtown Vancouver, and I was seeing, it was a walk-in clinic actually, and there were a lot of Japanese immigrants, and so they found out I could speak Japanese. And then soon, my former patients found out that I'm back practicing in downtown Vancouver, and walk-in clinic. These other doctors, they spend 5 minutes, 2 minutes, and it's something that takes very little time. Sore throat or earache. Here's a prescription. Goodbye. And here, my former patients coming from Burnaby, Richmond, Surrey, White Rock even, and Vancouver, and so they come to see me, and I feel so sorry that they took the time to come and see me, and I can't say, you're finished in 5 minutes, so I'm taking 15 minutes at least. But I did that for another 6-7 years, and I finally retired in 2009. I finally retired. So the Japanese language, it's too bad that my colleagues, like there are 2 other Japanese-speaking doctors, Dr. Shimizu, and Dr. Asano, but they're both from Japan, but they saw a lot of Japanese-speaking patients, and so I did my share. But when all of us retired, and there's no other Japanese-speaking doctors, and there's one fella whom I delivered, and then that family became my patients, and that mother, I looked after the father till he died of cancer, and the wife, the widow, had a job teaching Japanese at the Japanese language school, and this son, the names just escapes me right now, but he applied for getting into the medical school at UBC, and I wrote a nice letter of reference, a long letter. I said that the Japanese Canadian community needs a doctor who can speak Japanese, and here's a bright student who is bilingual in English and Japanese, and please consider him as a candidate to enter first year medical school. He tried 3 years and he couldn't get in.
So Japanese language served you well.
It served me very well, yes. Yes, I really appreciated what the Japanese language school. And do you remember a Mr. Fukui? Laura knows
Yeah.
because when I first started practicing, Mr. Fukui was one of my early patients. So I looked after the whole Fukui family,
Okay.
including Frank, who got quite involved with the Japanese language school, and he was my patient. And then when I retired, he became my son's patient, and unfortunately he passed away a few years ago. But Mr. Fukui was a patient, but he never failed to appear at my office every year without an appointment. And I knew what it was for, and it's for donation. And I donated every year to the Japanese language school through Mr. Fukui. And so I owed it to the school that they taught me Japanese. So, but all these former prominent figures like Mr. Iwata and Mr. Yada and all those people like Mr. Iwata bought the Roosevelt Hotel. Do you know that story? When we were allowed back to the coast in 1949, he was one of the first, and there was an old hotel right next to the Royal Theater, just Carnegie Hall, corner of Hastings and Main, and just west of Hastings, west of Main, on the south side, there was a old hotel called the Roosevelt Hotel. So most people who came back to the coast, like my dad, they left the family, where they were in self-supporting centers, and they came to the Roosevelt Hotel where they stayed, and till they established some sort of an occupation. Like my father started fishing, commercial fishing, and some bought land or leased land in the Fraser Valley, started strawberry farming and things like that. Yeah. Okay, well, what you mentioned culture.
Yeah.
One culture was what they call Hina Matsuri, Ohina-san. And there was a boys' day and a girls' day. And the girls' day was March the 3rd, and boys' day was May the 5th. And apparently now, Girls' Day is now called Children's Day. So it's not just restricted to girls. But my mother, before till Pearl Harbor, had 5 boys. So I was the oldest at age 10, and the youngest, Bob, was just 2 weeks old. He was born on March 1942. 2 months old when we were interned. But because my mother had all boys, all the dolls were boys' days, and she had dozens and dozens of boys' dolls. And there were lots of samurai dolls. And, for several days in the living room, they had, my father would make levels and covered it with a cloth, and all the dolls were displayed, in levels, and so the old dolls were the medieval days samurai dolls with, helmet and body armor and so on, and luckily my mother took some of those dolls. I don't know how she did it, because you were only allowed so many pounds of luggage to take, but she took 2 samurai dolls, and they're still in my townhouse, and Momotaro and Kintaro, and those were legendary dolls, and so I still have those. I'll probably give it to my children when we pass on. And then the last few years before Pearl Harbor, the country Japan became more involved with military, and the like Tojo was General Tojo, and talking about the military, I'm sure I learned a lot about the military in the Japanese language school, and so Admiral Admiral Tojo, who defeated the Russian fleet in the probably Sea of Japan or northern part of Japan, and he was quite famous. And then Nogi Taisho, and Taisho refers to general. So General Nogi was famous during the Manchurian War, right? And so he was famous, and I don't know whether Emperor Meiji's reign, the Manchurian War?
No, later.
Later.
Yeah.
But now whether it was the Manchurian War or the Russo-Japanese War, where there was a seaport called Ryojun, and there was a anyways, one of my patients, that they had no children, Mrs. Sugiwara, and you may have heard the name, but Mr. Sugiwara was quite involved with JCCA, and he was interested in what I knew before the war, so we became quite friendly, and I even loaned them two volume books. They will be antique in 2 years, published in 1924, and they were almost brand new. I bought it at an antique store, so I loaned it to them, and he read. It's all about the immigration going way back from Japan to Canada, and so Mr. Sugiwara was my age, and she knew about these war stories. And there was I think the Russian fleet was in this port, inside this port, and the Japanese Navy was purposely taking old ships to the mouth of the harbor and sinking them so the fleet cannot get out. So this major or whatever took the ship, and there's a song, and I could recite that song, just not right now, but this lady, Mrs. Sugiwara, knew the song that we both sang together, and he was before the ship was sinking, and the ship's engineer was lost, so he was looking for the ship's engineer, and he drowns, and so the Japanese government erected a statue of this man for his heroism. And then many years after the Second World War ended, this guy survived that sinking, and he swam to shore, married a Chinese lady, and became anonymous, but they found out that he was still alive, and Mrs. Sugiwara knew that. But during that Manchurian War, there were lots of things that came out on the Boys' Days dolls, and one of them I can still remember. It was called Nikudan Sanjushi. Nikudan, Niku is flesh, Dan is explosive, and Sanjushi. So 3 men, they were heroes, and they died. So my mother had a doll, and I remember that doll. So these 3 military men, they're carrying this long bomb, and with a fuse, and they are going on a suicide mission, and there are barbed wires, right? So they take it to the barbed wire, and the bomb explodes, so the Japanese men, the army men, can then advance. And we had those kinds of dolls, and so that's how the things changed in Japan, that they were worshiping military people, and my mother was buying these dolls, and when the war started, Second World War started, and we had to be interned, she burnt all those dolls. Can you imagine? They would be so precious. I mean, I don't mind she burning the military dolls, but there are a lot of these old medieval samurai dolls, like I still have, and they're, gosh, they must be 84 years old. Yeah. And talking about, so that's Ohina-san, and another culture was Boys' Day. My grandfather put up the koi. So he put up a flagpole outside our home on Heatley Avenue. And then I guess you would know that koi is a Japanese word for, what is it?
Goldfish, a big.
Oh, what was?
There's no other word for it. It's koi. I think.
It's like a koi is koi. We call it koi.
It's koi. I think.
It's like a catfish, right, with the barbels. And so there's a flag, like a flag with a wide open mouth and different colored. And my grandfather would have 3 or 4 of these on a flagpole, and he would put them up every year for Boys' Day. And so that culture is lost. I don't see anybody putting up kois for Boys' Day anymore. My memory of a lot of the war stories is something that I picked up at home, outside the school,
Oh, okay.
or whether they were being taught at the Japanese language school.
Yeah.
So that I'm not very clear on that,
Okay.
but
Yeah.
it's embedded in my brain. I have
Somehow.
lots of memories, and especially being all boys in the family, no girls, and that's, I guess, it was the samurai, not just the modern war years, the Russo-Japanese War, the war with China, but way back medieval days, I was at Kagoshima, and Kagoshima had it was about the turn of the century, and there was a Lord Shimazu, not Shimizu, but Shimazu, and it was under Meiji, and the Meiji emperor was trying to modernize Japan, and Lord Shimazu, secretly was sending his top-notch, military people or academics overseas to North America, to Europe, to learn about their culture and so on, because in Toyotomi Hideyoshi days, it was banned, right? So under Lord Shimazu, there was a civil war between Emperor Meiji and the feudal system, and the man that was famous, and again, I should know, but there's a beautiful statue of this man who fought for the feudal system. And Tom Cruise's war called the Last Samurai, that depicts that war. And this guy was really high-ranking samurai, and so he decides to fight against the Meiji, and this taxi driver told us where we were staying at the hotel in Kagoshima, and as we came down the hill, there was a cave, and there was a man-made cave, and this guy's soldiers dug this cave to hide this military man, and but he decided at the end, no, he's gonna come out and fight. And he was wounded. He got shot, bows and arrows, fighting cannons and rifles. But he got shot in the side of his abdomen, shot in the thigh. He was wounded, but he came down the hill and he gets killed. But there's a famous statue for what he did for his country before that Civil War. And so there are things like that. And
But getting
Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Tokugawa Ieyasu, all those things that I remember. But I guess I picked it up as I was growing up rather than in the school.
Yeah.
Like a lot of people who went to East Lillooet.
Really?
Yeah.
Like
And
my grandfather.
I guess a lot of those parents, my father's parent generation, they probably thought that the war was going to be over in a few years, and I won't mention names, but this father, when the son was born in East Lillooet, in probably the second year, probably 1943, he named him Katsutoshi. You know what that means? Katsu means you're going to win. Toshi is the year. So the year that Japan's going to win. So he named that son Katsutoshi. He's not called by that name anymore. He's got an English name. But that's how the father felt, right? He probably felt that his birth country, Japan, was going to win. We never communicated very much. When I talk to students and I talk about Mr. Matsumoto and how he was a First World War veteran, he never, it was my grandfather who took me to that confectionery store on Jackson and Powell, because my father's away fishing lingcod up in Lund. So not till after the war, my communication with my dad was whenever he came home, for short periods. Yeah, and East Lillooet, and he was kind of a tyrant. He was just, can you imagine, lingcod fisherman going to East Lillooet, no employment, like the Kawamoto family had to move, right? And the Tsuki family started the tomato agriculture, and but he was longing to get back to lingcod fishing. So as soon as the war ended, and I was in Vancouver in 1949, first year university, I was so happy that they allowed me to go to university when I graduated from Lillooet High School in 49, and so I went on to university. And but he was just waiting for me to finish first year. So as soon as I finished April of 1950, I was a deckhand on this cod boat, and I helped him buy that cod boat in December 49 because I took um, oh, uh, another Issei from East Lilith and my dad an overnight CP ferry to Victoria to look for a cod boat. And Mr. Matsunaga found a cod boat in Sydney, and he took it up to Canberra River, and his family did very well and became very wealthy, and he donated, the Matsunaga family donated, I think, $5,000 for the first garden because they got into the fish business. They bought hotels, they got into trading and all that sorts of things. But so he went to Canberra River. My father went to Lund. The Finnish people in Lund welcomed him in open arms, and so my dad was waiting for me to finish first year university. So I don't think he cared about me going to university. Although, maybe my mother's influence. But, in those, a little bit about lingcod fishing. In those days, you just had a compass. And lingcod, you have to have knowledge of where the lingcod, the reef, you have a reef here, and they're all named Furuse, Church Reef, Hamase, named after Mr. Hama from Mirozu, and so on. And you take a landmark here and a landmark here, and when you crisscross, that's where the reef was. And right in the middle of the Strait of Georgia, between the north end of Texada and Comox, there was a very good reef, about 70 fathoms deep. But you can only go there on a clear day because you gotta have landmarks on Vancouver Island and landmarks at Powell River. And he would say, be attentive. Make sure you remember. Get those landmarks in your head. Write it down. So he wanted me to be an lingcod fisherman, for sure. Because he used to lecture me. He said, you got to remember those landmarks. Now, you got GPS and echo sounder and all that. But that's what he was like. And this is why those were hard times in Lillooet, East Lillooet. I was the last person to bicycle home from high school because I was working part-time, in a small family-run orchard, picking fruit during the summer or fall time. I got a job at Ma Murray's Bridge River Lillooet News. Ma Murray was gone. She was in the press piece. So I worked for Danny Murray, the son, and I got the job working the printing press. You ink it, and I was printing business cards, card by card, with a foot pedal. You operate this like this, and we're printing letterheads. So that, I don't know how much I got paid, 25 cents an hour, and so I did all that, and then I worked hard on the weekends, and so money was very precious, and So my dad came back fishing, but could not bring the family back to Vancouver in 49. So this is why I had to take 2 years out of school, became a commercial fisherman, and went back to UBC 1952. So money was so precious, and people laugh when I tell them the story. Maybe I told the story over and over, and you've heard it. But first year university, room and board and tuition and books cost me a total of just over $600. In those days, there were streetcars going up Dunbar, and I was at a room and board place at 26 and Dunbar, and this lady was a Scottish lady, Jessie Stewart, I remember, and I was 17, not quite 18 when I started UBC, and she treated me like a son, did my washings, and she had to teach me how to use a fork and knife, because before the war and pre-war and during the war, you know, we never had money to buy meat. My mother didn't know how to make roast beef, so didn't know how to use a fork and knife. And Jessie Stewart had to show me how to use a fork and knife, because every Sunday she had a full course dinner. Yeah, yeah, and the only meat we could afford in Lillooet was bologna and wieners. And my mother, I go to work and I open my lunch pail and it's a tomato sandwich at a tomato farm, tomato sandwich or wiener sandwich. So first year university, to save 10 cents streetcar fare, I would hitchhike. And I got to know a war veteran in my English class who, I guess he got some money, and he had an MG, those flat MG with two-seaters, and he lived near 19th and Dunbar. So every morning I would walk down from 26th and Dunbar to the 19th Avenue, and he would give me a ride to UBC. But to come home, to save 10 cents, I would hitchhike. And that's how, and George, this Jesse's son, was in first year law. And I guess Jesse was, she wasn't rich, so he was, using his house room and board. And so for weekends, we didn't have money to go to a theater to see a movie. We played Monopoly. And George Stewart eventually became a judge up in Prince George. But that's how precious money was to me. So just the same as the story of Jimmy Patterson. He started working in the used car lot washing cars, and he used to go to the pay phones and check to see if there's money in the till. So I became a gillnet fisherman, and first year, 1950, I was a deckhand, and I had to learn the ropes of how to become a commercial fisherman. And I told the story recently to somebody that it was the first time about all the discrimination and racism, that it was the first time I came face to face was a young racist guy. My father had to take the cod boat to a shipyard in Cole Harbor. And Cole Harbor was industrialized in those days with a Queen Charlotte fish cannery and shipyards. And then as we approached the shipyard, there was a young man standing there, and I don't know how he recognized us to be Japanese Canadians, or me as a Japanese Canadian. He says, "You can't dock here, you Japs." And then, but anyways, I jumped off the boat and tied the boat, and I went up face to face. First time, I hear about racism, but to talk to a racist person face to face, few feet apart. And he said, "You can't dock here." He says, you go back to Tojo, you Jap." And Tojo was General Tojo, who was executed for war crimes because he was the prime minister. And he knew that. And so he called me, and he, was a young man in his probably early 20s or mid-20s, and he knew about Mr. Tojo. But I tell the story that my answer to what he said, I gave him a 10-minute history about democracy, racism, and democracy. But that's how I became a deckhand and learned the ropes. And from the second year, I was all by myself, and my brother became my next brother, who was 2 years younger. He was a young teenager, and he became a deckhand for 1 year. And then I went back to school, UBC, in 1952. I continued fishing as a gillnet fisherman for a total of 7 years. And being a gillnet fisherman, I made more than twice an average wage earner would earn. Yeah. And every penny went to my family. And I don't mind saying that when I graduated from medical school, I used to keep it a secret, but I was every penny I earned I gave to my parents. So I was a poor man. My wife married a poor man who was in debt, student loan debt, and everything. And then I went to Toronto to intern at $60, $120 a month. So she worked in the same hospital as a nurse, and she supported me. And we came back to Vancouver, and a few tough years, but we survived.
Eventually.
Yeah. So, anyways, the end of the story is I had a very interesting life. I had good times, bad times. I worked hard, and my oldest grandson just graduated in biomedical engineering. He's 28 now, but he said he appreciates me, that I had ingrained in my grandchildren that you gotta work hard, you study hard, and the end results will be rewarding. And so that's a sort of a legacy I left behind. Yeah.